Along the top of the player detail page, you'll see three different ratings. Each of the ratings are a 0 to 100 numeric value, with 100 being the best. If you look at the first rating, the player rating, indicates the player's current value. This takes into account all the different games that they've played so far and how they've fared against different levels of competition. If you look at the far right value, ROS rating, or rest of season rating, this looks at the future opponents that the player has yet to face and determines whether or not we think they're going to perform better or worse than they have so far this year. So if you see a value, like in this case, which is lower than the player's rating, this indicates that this player might trend down towards the end of the season, or that you might be expecting less from this player than you've gotten from him so far. That's what the red arrow indicates here next to ROS rating. But in the middle, you look at the weekly rating. So this indicates for the current week, in this case it happens to be week 6, we're expecting a 95 rating out of a player who in this case was normally an 83. This means that you can expect more, and in this case, a lot more than you've gotten in normal weeks from Michael Thomas throughout the season. In some cases, you might also notice dots under a player's name. You'll really only notice those in rookies or second year players, and really what it means is that the machine does not have the desired amount of data that it would like to have on this player in order to make predictions. It doesn't mean that it doesn't have any data at all. It just means that some really big games, if a player's only played a couple in their whole career, might influence their player rating more than they normally would. Not so concerning when you see it with second year players like Michael Thomas in this case, because you see here he's got 3 out of 5 dots, which means we've got well over half of the data that the machine requires for him. So you can be pretty confident about these projections. But if you're looking at a rookie who's just played 2 games and they have 1 dot, for example, that means that the player rating that they've been given maybe doesn't mean as much because they've only played a couple of games. So really, ideally, the more data that we get for any player, the more reliable our predictions can be. If you look down into the middle section, you'll see that we've got some artificial intelligence that the machine generates for you. It will give you information about the player and their current matchup, and in a lot of cases, other players with similar ratings and how those players have fared against these same matchups. When you look at each week, you see that we have 1 row for all remaining games for that player for the rest of the season. And you see here in the current week, the first column is the week number. The second column is the opponent that they're facing. And if you want to just simply look at how good or bad the matchup is in that opponent, what you'll see here is we've got these arrows. We've got 4 different levels of matchups. So if we're looking at a wide receiver in this case, we want to know how the defenses fare against fantasy wide receivers. So if you take all 32 of the defenses in the NFL and you rank them from top to bottom as the easiest matchup for fantasy wide receivers all the way down to the worst, we can break those down into 4 tiers. The top tier of those matchups are what we call the great matchups. You'll see here that's represented with a solid green upward facing arrow. The next tier down are what are called good matchups, and you'll see those indicated by the white arrow with the green outline. And then we get into the non-desirable bottom half of the matchups. And then we have bad matchups, which are indicated by a down-facing arrow. And then finally, the worst matchups that you can have, or the toughest matchups that you can have, are the solid red down-facing arrow. The next column that you see is just the start times for players in case they have any odd start times you should be aware of for a current week. And then the rest of these 2 columns here, the home, away, and surface, tell us just some of the matchup factors that go into determining their weekly rating and how it might affect their normal production. So what you see here when you look at the home and the dome values on week 6 for Michael Thomas is it simply says that fantasy wide receivers do not fare as well at home as they do on the road. Might be a surprise to you. This changes every week, and it only marginally affects their weekly matchup. But then you also see that fantasy wide receivers that play in a dome fare worse in a dome than they do on grass or artificial surfaces. That might be a surprise to you. And again, these values are updated every week, and they're specific to the position categories, not necessarily this player. And they are not weighted as heavily as the matchup is when determining the weekly rating. So in this case, you'll also see a matchup adjustment The matchup adjustment tells us what the difference is from the player's year-to-date value and their weekly rating. It's just the math between these two values right here. But what's nice about it is when you see a green going up, that means that you can expect more from this player this week than you would normally. And if you see a red arrow going down, that means you can expect less. And the value that you see tells us how much more you can expect or how much less you can expect. So if you see a plus 12 or a plus 16 or a plus 14, those are good matchups you should be excited about. A minus 28 or a minus 25 are bad matchups that you probably shouldn't be too fired up about. And here a plus 3 just tells us it's a marginally better matchup due to some different factors. The other tabs here, you'll see, for example, similar players, and these are players that the algorithm determines to be at the same level of value as the current player. You might want to look at their value for the week or even the value for the rest of the season. And if you're interested, you can even click over and compare the player that you have selected here as well as whichever player's row that you click on. Year to date just shows all the different values for the player year to date. And you can see that the player ratings change throughout the course of the season, and those are affected by the matchups that they faced and how well they did against those matchups. You'll see that Michael Thomas started off the season as an 86, which is a pretty high value. And then he went against the Minnesota defense, which was a tough matchup. And unfortunately, he only scored 4.5 points. That then lowered his year-to-date value down to 80, at which time he went against an excellent matchup, and then again only fared 8.9 fantasy points. That too will drop your matchup value. So he ended up as a 77, went against Carolina, who's moderate, and did pretty well, although that continued to drop him because of the inertia that you see from some of the data previous to these week 3 week. You're going to need to see more performances outperforming the good matchups in order to really move that value even higher. It's also affected, of course, by the different players in that same category as sort of a bell curve rating. But this gives you an idea to see the history of their player rating and how they got to where they were, and also some of the scoring that they've done based on what their weekly rating projections were. If you need any further definitions, you can just look at the glossary on the bottom of each page, which gives you the specific definitions of all of the different elements that you see listed on the player detail page.